Today we are having the last of our Books That Shaped America series for this year. And the Books That Shaped America series is based on the Library of Congress Books That Shaped America list. This is a list of 80 some odd books that they believe maybe weren't the most seminal works, but at least sparked a lot of conversation. So that's why they shaped America, as it were. Today we have Tristan Capello, who is the Director of American Studies here at AU, and he's going to lead a discussion on the book called And the Band Played On by Randy Shilts. And this is the story of how the AIDS epidemic spread and how the government was sort of initially didn't really do anything about it, seemed indifferent to it, which allowed it to spread maybe even further, and what some of the outcomes were from that. As I mentioned, he's Director of American Studies at American University, and his research explores the intersection of race, sexuality, class identities, and popular culture in modern American culture. His first monograph is called Queer Bronzeville, Race, Sexuality, and Black Chicago, 1920 to 1980, and it documents the making of African American queer identities in Chicago. Prior to being here at AU, Capello taught at the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and Bowdoin College. Here at American, he teaches various courses in the American Studies program, among them The Global Cultures of Michael Jackson, In the Life, Black Queer Culture and History, and Washington, D.C., Life Inside a Monument. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Danny, for inviting me to do this conversation. I was really delighted when Danny invited me to lead the conversation on this book because it is one of my favorite books, and it's probably one of the books that actually influenced me to do what I'm doing today. And two, I think this is truly a book that shaped American discourses on AIDS and HIV, and those discourses are still influential today. So for the first part of the session, I guess I will present the book, comment on the book, contextualize the book, and then I will open up the floor for discussion and a conversation. And of course, you should feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions and any comments to add to my presentation. So for those of you who have no clue what the book is about, the book chronicles the first years of the AIDS epidemic in America. It starts in 1978 with the death of a Danish doctor who contracted AIDS in Africa. And it ends in 1985 with the death of Rock Hudson. And in most of my classes, I always have to explain who Rock Hudson was. Rock Hudson was a very famous actor in the Hollywood Golden Age in the 50s and the 60s, and then had a second career as a TV actor. And in June 1985, he comes on TV with his very good friend Doris Day for a press conference, and he appears to be very frail. And what he says also on TV doesn't make a lot of sense. And in August 1985, he discloses that he has AIDS, and he dies shortly after in October 1985. And here you see, how extremely inelegantly AIDS patients or victims were treated at the time. I mean, they juxtapose a picture of him in his prime with a picture of him sick. But after 1985, because this is the first celebrity that actually came out as an AIDS patient, things start to change in the general public. But the bulk of the book is between 1981 and 1985, and this is a time where, again, an AIDS diagnosis is a death sentence. AIDS patients are not very well treated in hospitals and in medical facilities, and the government, the media, the medical agencies are not doing too much to help, hence the title of the book, And the Band Played On. When I started graduate work in 2005, I realized that that was a book that was actually influential for many LGBT writers and scholars. They all cited the book as one of the reasons why they started doing work in LGBT history. One, because they realized that it was possible to do, that that was a valid field to explore. And in the 1980s and 1990s, there were not too many books on LGBT history. And two, they wanted to replace agency at the center of LGBT historiography. Because as you will see in, later on in the presentation, AIDS victims in Schilt's book are really that, victims. He doesn't spend a lot of time describing those victims who were actually reading, those patients who were actually reading obscure medical journal articles, importing drugs from Germany, Holland, France, having underground clinic just to help them survive. So let me give you some context and a short history of the AIDS epidemic. Then I will explore the main themes in the book, and then I will talk also about few of its shortcomings. Does anybody know when the first case of AIDS was reported in America?
76.
No.
Early 80s.
Early 80s. It was actually in 1981. The first cases are reported by the CDC, and of course at the time it's not called AIDS, in 1981 because there are 5 gay men who have all been diagnosed with a strange form of pneumonia, PCP. Which is usually a form of pneumonia that you get when people are much older first, and also when your immune system is compromised. So it's in June 5th, 1981 that the CDC sends the first report, but a couple of days earlier, the New York Times already releases the news that a rare cancer has been seen in 41 homosexuals. That was, I think, July the 2nd, and it's on page 49 of the New York Times. And so there is these long articles about this cancer where that nobody knows really how to treat. Of course, that doesn't mean that AIDS appears in America in 1981. We know for sure now that we can trace the virus all the way to the 1900s in Africa. And we know that in 1969, a 15-year-old African-American teenager from St. Louis died of HIV, died of AIDS. And we also know that this person, started to develop symptoms in 1966. And we also know that he never got out of St. Louis. So that means that the virus was already present in the United States in the 60s. Okay? But it doesn't get reported because it impacts marginalized communities, and predominantly in the 70s, probably IV drug users, okay, who do not have access to health care. So why do these first 5 cases emerge in 1981? We are just, the Stonewall riots are just 12 years old in 1981. And there's a lot of things that happened in the 70s, the gay liberation movement, gay newspapers, gay neighborhoods, gay prides. And so those 5 gay men here who are being reported as, and it's all funny now to hear that, as active homosexuals, are well off. They live in the Castro, in West Hollywood, in Greenwich Village. they're well educated, they have good jobs, they have access to healthcare, and more importantly, they are out to their doctors. It's 1981, and they are out to their doctors, or maybe even their doctors are gay. Okay, and they have no problem discussing their sexuality because they are active, apparently, with their doctors. So this is a very condensed timeline, ridiculously condensed timeline of the history of the AIDS epidemic. Shields makes the argument in his book that the medical condition AIDS should have become a chronic manageable condition like diabetes as early as 1985. And as you can see in the short timeline here, it actually takes 20 years to get a treatment that works. So in 1981, the CDC reports the first cases of pneumonia. In 1982, they know that the disease is sexually transmitted. And they label the medical condition GRID. Does anybody know what that refers to?
Gay-related immune deficiency?
Exactly, gay-related immune deficiency. So they link it to gay behaviors. By 1982, they realized very early on, right? And 1982 is just a year after the first reports. They realized that half of the patients are actually not gay. And they renamed the condition AIDS. In 1983, they know that the virus is transmitted through blood and semen. In 1983, there's a team in Paris at the Institut Pasteur under the leadership of Professor Luc Montagnier that identifies the virus that is believed to cause the medical condition AIDS, and they call it LAV, okay, or LAV. There's another team right here in Bethesda that works on identifying the virus too, and they discover another virus that they think is the one that causes AIDS, and they call it HTLV. They discover actually two viruses. They discover HTLV1 and HTLV2. By 1985, they find out, it takes 2 years. By 1985, they find out that those two viruses, those two retroviruses, are actually the same. And the year after, they finally agree on a name for that virus, and they call it HIV. And in 1987, the FDA approves the first drug to treat HIV, which do you remember what it was called?
Ovir or Ciclovir?
So it was marketed Retrovir. It was.
AZT was later, wasn't it?
So AZT was the actual name of the molecule, and it was sold under the name of Retrovir. Okay, that was AZT, and AZT actually worked for a while. It works for a couple of months, but then the virus becomes resistant to it. This is still a drug that's actually used randomly nowadays in treatment, but in combination with other drugs. In 1996, 10 years later, the first cocktails to treat HIV are approved by the FDA. The goal of this treatment is to render the virus undetectable. Okay, so people are still positive to HIV, but the virus is undetectable, which means it doesn't cause any damage to the body anymore. But those first cocktails are very heavy in side effects. People are not dying of HIV or AIDS anymore. It does save lives, but people are dying of the side effects. It raises cholesterol, blood pressure. It has all types of side effects. And in 2002, there's a second generation of highly active antiretroviral therapy that comes onto the market that looks much better with fewer side effects, fewer pills to take, and patients are actually able to live normal lives under this treatment. Does anybody know what the situation looks like nowadays? Do we have a cure? No? So there are actually people there's actually one person who got cured from HIV. The Berlin patient. The Berlin patient was a person that both had leukemia and HIV, and received a treatment. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a biologist, so I don't know the details, and don't quote me on this. But received a treatment that involved a bone marrow transplant, and he was found out HIV negative after the bone marrow transplant, which means that not only the virus had disappeared from his body, but also the antibody. What does treatment look like nowadays?
A lot of pills.
I'm sorry.
A lot of pills.
Well, actually, no. Actually, nowadays, if you read The Blade every week, you see that there's a new pill that comes onto the market that's a once-a-day pill that treats that treats HIV. So now the standard treatment for HIV is we have a bunch of once-a-day pill that renders the virus undetectable. Okay, so the treatment nowadays, the gold standard treatment is usually one pill per day. It's one pill, of course, that combines several molecules.
Do most people who are positive get the same treatment, or are there a variety of treatments?
I'm sorry.
Does everyone get the same treatment, or are there a variety
The
of
CDC
treatments
recommends
based on-
a certain medication for people who get first diagnosed. I don't remember what they are, but the gold standard right now is, I think, a pill named Atripla. But there are several. Some of them need to be taken with food. Some of them need to be taken in the morning. So usually the doctor asks the patient, what works better for the patient's routine. But it is also true that the virus can develop resistance, and that treatment needs to be changed.
It's not a cure.
It's absolutely not a cure. No, it is a treatment. It is a treatment. And also, of course, now what we have is a preventive treatment that's called PrEP. That is a pill that a lot of individuals are taking. A lot of individuals who are at risk to prevent infection. Okay. That's extremely popular in gay communities and in couples where one of the member is HIV positive, for example.
And is that available worldwide or mostly in Western countries?
Of course, there are all those pills, and that's the main problem with HIV treatment. Those pills are available in the Western countries, right? And of course, not everybody in America has access to those pills either.
And they're expensive, I assume.
They cost a minimum of $2,000 per month.
$2,000.
Sorry, is that PrEP or the
PrEP costs $1,200 per month. That's of course the retail price. Nobody pays that price, of course. But PrEP, which is a pill called I forgot now, Truvada, it's a blue pill, costs $1,200 per month. Okay. Of course, nobody pays that price, but still, it is extremely expensive. You had a question?
Yeah, how frequently do you take PrEP?
you take it every day.
Also do it.
Yeah, it's an
Is that
every
for
day.
the rest of your life? Or as long as you're sexually active?
Well, as long as you're sexually active. Well, as long as you're sexually active, or when you are sexually active. But this is PrEP is designed to prevent infection. So yes, it's as long as you are sexually active. But again, it does help in populations who are at risk. Not everybody, of course, does need to be on PrEP. And the medical and the pharmaceuticals are making a lot of money also out of this pill. And so as I was doing research, as I was looking at the latest scientific research for this presentation, I realized that now the life expectancy for a person who gets diagnosed with HIV in 2017 is approximately the same as the life expectancy of a person who was not diagnosed. Okay. Some doctors even argue that the life expectancy of a person who gets diagnosed with HIV in 2017 may get a higher life expectancy simply because when you get diagnosed with HIV, you need to go to the doctor much more often than the regular person. An HIV patient goes to the doctor every 2-3 months, so any conditions gets treated and diagnosed very early. So that's for the context of the book. Let me talk a bit about Schiltz, who wrote the book. Schiltz was born in 1951. He grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and then he moves to Oregon to get a degree in journalism. And he comes out in college at age 20. And when he graduates, he finds it, this is the 70s, he finds it very difficult to find employment. So he moved to San Francisco, where everybody moves in the 1970s. And he finds a job at the San Francisco Chronicle when he is hired to report on gay news. And starting in 1981, he exclusively reports on AIDS. On the side, Schiltz writes a lot of books. He published 4 in his lifetime, but he works on books. And one of the books that he works on in the late 70s is a biography of Harvey Milk. And it's on this biography that the recent movie that was out in 2007, 2008 with Sean Penn was based on. He starts working on And the Band Played On in 1983, but the book is published in 1987. Again, guys, I don't know if you saw it, but it's a 600-page book. It's a long book. While he works on the book, he regularly gets tested for HIV, but he does ask his doctor not to disclose the results to him because he doesn't want to be biased as he writes the book. And in 1987, after the book is published, his doctor tells him that he's HIV positive. And almost instantly, Schiltz starts taking ACT, and he dies in the mid-1990s. What's interesting about Schiltz is that he actually never disclosed his status, all the way until not until a couple of weeks before he died. Okay, he never said that he was HIV positive. At some point, when he becomes HIV positive, when he hears the news that he's HIV positive and that he has to go on treatment, he moves out of San Francisco. He works on another book on gay soldiers during the Vietnam War, but we do not see him anymore. He doesn't appear on TV So what is the book about? The book chronicles the early years of the AIDS epidemic, and the argument is basically contained in the title. While everybody was dying, people, because the subtitle of the book is Politics, People, and the AIDS Epidemic, and what's under that umbrella term of people is gay communities, medical communities, the news media, government agencies, did not do anything. First, Shields talks at length about gay communities in the Castro and in Greenwich Village. And as I reread the book last week, I realized that there's a bit of self-loathing. There's a bit of what psychologists will call internalized homophobia. He criticizes a lot the reactions of gay men in the Castro and in Greenwich Village, and often his description is very one-dimensional. He doesn't try to understand why they reacted a certain way. And he often labels them as them, as if he's actually excluding himself from the wider community. For example, he criticizes gay men of the Castro for being very angry when, or refusing the idea that bathhouses in San Francisco should be closed. By 1984, the city issues an ordinance requiring all bathhouses to be closed in order to contain the epidemic. And gay males in the Castro are reacting very violently to that. They're not happy. And Randy Shields labeled them as immature. But of course, those were men also. But on the other hand, those were men who had moved to the Castro for that precise reason, to have sex with other men. Those were men who had gone through years of shaming wherever they lived outside of San Francisco. And those were people who did not believe that there could be such a thing, such a disease, a virus that only attacked or infected gay people. And actually, one of the most famous quotation about AIDS by Michel Foucault, by the French theorist Michel Foucault, is kind of valuable in that context. Michel Foucault is very well known to have said in 1983, a disease that only kills gay men is too good to be true. And of course, Michel Foucault dies a couple of years later of the medical condition. So it's often a story of villains and heroes, and there are the irresponsible, childish gay men who still want to have sex in bathhouses, and there are the heroes. And the heroes are often those activists who have tried to save the community. Here, for example, Larry Kramer is on the first picture, and Bill Krause on the second picture. Larry Kramer was very active in New York. Bill Krause was very active in San Francisco. But he never really critiques also their activism, which at times was problematic. Shields also tells the story of what was happening in the medical community. So he tells the story of how many doctors in San Francisco, many gay doctors in San Francisco, LA, New York, actually helped patients. But he also tells a story that the medical staff was not really aware of the way HIV was transmitted, and so did not treat AIDS patients fairly. Often AIDS patients were not touched, they were not provided with meals. Some nurses refused to do blood work on AIDS patients. But more importantly, he spends a lot of time, and I think that this is one of the best rendering of that battle, explaining the battle between the French team and the American team in the discovery of the virus. Because for 4 years actually, those teams are fighting against the discovery of the HIV virus. On the first picture, you have one person that worked under Luc Montagnier. Luc Montagnier never did a lot of research on AIDS, but he had a team of researchers that he was supervising. And so Willy Rosenbaum, here on the first picture, was one of the co-discoverers of the HIV virus. And of course, Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, who just got the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, was the other co-discoverer of the HIV virus. And Robert Gatto, who was working here in Bethesda, those two teams were fighting over who actually discovered the virus first, and it lasted 3 years. And Randy Shields really does a good job in detailing what that battle, what that struggle was about. And of course, he does talk a lot about the lack of response from the government. As it is well known, Ronald Reagan did not utter the word AIDS until 1985, and that was in a press conference. And it's not until 1987 that Ronald Reagan gives his first speech on AIDS. And of course, at first, and it's very interesting because it's given in that organization that Elizabeth Taylor presides. And the first part of the speech is excellent. He says what everybody wants to hear. We need to treat AIDS patients with compassion, with love. We need to integrate them into our families, and so on and so forth. And then he drops the bomb. He announces that all HIV positive individuals will be banned from entering the country. That means that HIV was actually added to the list of communicable diseases that would make you not only ineligible to enter the United States, but also to get a visa, to get permanent residency, to get citizenship. And the ban was still in place until 2009. So until 2009, technically, an HIV positive person could not enter the United States. Of course, nobody was testing people at the border, right? But that means that people were hiding their medications, or did not take their medications. And it also means that a lot of people were eligible for permanent residency, for example, or for visas, did not apply, right? Because for visas and for permanent residency, they actually did test people. So that's what the book is about. And it's a very good book for getting the facts about the first couple of years of the AIDS epidemic. But as I said in the beginning, the book also displays a few shortcomings, and I think it also contributed to shaping stereotypical discourses on AIDS in America. First, this is not a scholarly book. Shields never claimed to be an historian. Shields never claimed to be an academic. It's the book of a journalist. So there are scenes where, for example, he describes an AIDS patient alone dying in his room in a hospital, and he knows what the AIDS patient is thinking. So of course there's absolutely no way of knowing precisely what that person was thinking all alone in his room. And for a book that's 600 page long, there are actually 3 pages of footnotes. So we do not really know what the sources are, and most of the sources that he quotes are actually his own articles that he published in the San Francisco Chronicles. So this is a book that has kind of a hybrid position in Haig's historiography, because it is the first one. It is the first book that we have on the AIDS epidemic, but it's not really rigorous. Okay, it does give the fact. It creates a discourse very clearly, but it's not a scholarly book. 2, there is absolutely no diversity in this book. It is, although Shields does argue in the first couple of pages that in the very first year we know that the virus, AIDS, that the condition affects people beyond race, sexual orientation, gender, etc., etc. This is a book that primarily focuses on white gay males who lived in gay neighborhoods. And this really could have been corrected if Shields had read the sources that he had a little bit more in detail. Because, for example, we know that Shields had access to the listing of people who were diagnosed with AIDS early on in 1981, 1982 in San Francisco. Of course, an anonymous listing. People were listed by number. And we do know that patient number 6 and patient number 8 were actually African-American gay males who lived in the Castro. But he never talks about them. He does a lot of research on the first 5, but he doesn't really talk that much about other people who were impacted by the virus. And also, quite frankly, he puts a lot of emphasis on the activism that was done in Greenwich Village, in the Castro, in West Hollywood, but does not talk about the activism, the very real activism that was also done in Harlem, in Oakland, on the South Side. For example, I know, because this is the research that I do, that very early on the South Side of Chicago, in a black gay club in 1983, they already had meetings about what was called at the time HTLV. And they already had meetings with people who were impacted by the disease, infected with HTLV, talking about the way it was transmitted and the way transmission could be prevented. So very early on, not only in white gay neighborhoods, in black neighborhoods, in Latino neighborhoods, in working class neighborhoods, there were a lot of work that was being done and that Shields doesn't really touch on. And finally, there's this. Does anybody know who that person is?
Patient 0.
Patient 0, right? So
It's been in the news recently.
Of course, but I mean, it's always in the news because there's. What was in the news recently?
That they've disproven that he had anything to do with
Oh
it.
yeah, of course, yeah. This is patient zero. His real name is Gaëtan Dugas. He's a French-Canadian flight attendant. And he's one of the main characters in the book. And more importantly, this is one of the characters, this is one of the plot line that's used to publicize the book on TV, on radio, in the newspaper. And as I said, Dugas is a French-Canadian gay man. He's a flight attendant. He's traveled all over America since 1972, all over North America since 1972. He knows that he has the cancer. He is diagnosed with the cancer very early on, but he chooses not to believe that the cancer is sexually transmitted, and he chooses to continue to have a sex life. Okay. And so he's labeled as patient zero because Shields believe that he's that person that spread the virus all over America. And more importantly, in the book, he's really described as kind of being mentally unstable, having this sociopathic behavior that is infecting people on purpose, that is infecting people intentionally with a virus that we have not even identified yet. Okay. So there's a couple of issues here. First, and this is where sometimes Shields lacks in terms of rigorous research. Dugas was never mentioned as being patient zero in the scientific literature that was available at the time. He was numbered patient 57 in San Francisco, but he was also dubbed patient O because he was from outside the area. Okay, so it seems here that Shields misreads the sources that he has access to. Two, Shields never mentions the fact that Dugas was actually quite influential in identifying the way the disease was transmitted. Because most of the patients that, most of the AIDS patients that doctors were treating in San Francisco at the time averaged 400 to 500 sexual partners a year. And Dugas claimed, it's not that he claimed, it's that we know that between 1972 and 1981, he had 2,500 sexual partners. And how do we know that? Is because Dugas keeps a sex diary. He keeps a log. He records in his diary who he has sex with, where he has sex with, in what city he is, etc., etc. And Gaëtan Dugas, being this French-Canadian flight attendant with a thick accent and described in the book as being gorgeous, is also readily identifiable. People do remember him. You know, people who had sex with him do remember him. Doctors can actually trace very easily and confirm ways the virus was transmitted. And finally, this is an issue that's still relevant today. 24 states in America still require HIV positive people to disclose their status before they have sex with somebody. And the sentence for not disclosing can be quite heavy. It's jail time, and it could be lifetime in prison. And so it seems that here, what I'm getting at is that Shields already classifies AIDS patients. They are the victims, you know, the hemophiliacs, Ryan White, those who died of horrible death in the beginning of the book. And there are those who continue to have sex, which will become, you know, later on the guys on the down lows, or the guys who are not disclosing their status, you know. And very, very recently, actually, there is a college student, well, his real name is not Tiger Mendigo, his name is Michael Johnson, that was sentenced to 10 years in jail, I think, for not disclosing his status to four of his sexual partners. Throughout the trial, he claimed his innocence. He said that he actually disclosed his status, but still was sentenced to jail. So the criminalization of you know, HIV transmission is still a problem, you know, nowadays in America. People are being deported for those reasons. People are in jail for those reasons. And I think that this is one of the issues, you know, that actually starts being discussed in the book. That's all that I wanted to say for today, and I think I exceeded the time that was allotted to me. But for those of you who do not want to go through those 600 pages, the book was actually turned into a movie that's pretty good, but still pretty long, more than 2 hours. Fascinating, with Phil Collins in the role of a bathhouse owner. It's a really good movie, and it does justice to the book, which is already written like a movie script, really. So thank you guys for your time, and if you have any questions, any comments, I'm happy to take those.
What became of the Dugas? You say recently he was again in the news?
Well, just the fact that they'd identified that he was not the cause of AIDS in America, that he didn't bring it to the U.S. He was identified mostly in the book as the one guy who...
The book was marketed on the idea that this was the guy who brought AIDS to America, or who spread AIDS in the United States, because he was a flight attendant that was having sex with a lot of people all over the U.S. And of course, I mean, even at the time, I don't know how anybody could believe that, but very shortly after the book was released, a lot of doctors have actually said that made actually no sense at all. And now we know that the virus was present in America, you know, probably as early as 1960, so it really made no sense. But the fact that he's scapegoating him for the fact that Shields himself believes that is pretty problematic.
Do you think he believed it, or do you think he added it or enhanced the idea that there was one guy who was...
After Shields died, Shields actually never said anything about Patient Zero. But after Shields died, his publisher said that he encouraged Shields to flesh out the story about Patient Zero. He encouraged him to talk more about him in the book because he thought that would be a selling point. And indeed, in interviews at the time, this is really what they talk about. I mean, they talk about Patient Zero all the time. Yeah.
I read it in 1997, and that's the part I remember the best.
No, of course. I mean, because it takes so much of the book anyway. I mean, we know everything about this guy, you know, and even in the movie, you see this guy all the time. I mean, and he's really portrayed as this completely immature, where he says a couple of very smart things to the doctors too. I mean, he tells them, well, you know, 30 years ago, you guys thought that I was diseased just because I was gay. So, and how can a cancer be transmitted sexually? You know, he has some very valid points, you know, at the time.
Was he alive when the book was published?
No, he died in 1984, and the book was published in 1987.
Isn't the title a reference to the Titanic? The sinking.
Probably, probably.
To the band
Yeah,
playing All the Dead.
It is as the world, as everything is crumbling and falling apart around you, the band is playing on like nothing is happening. The government is functioning,
yeah,
and everyone is ignoring what is happening.
yeah, absolutely.
Has you come across any research on comparing the way society has handled this disease versus others, like Ebola or others that have mysterious diseases that have had to be characterized as quickly as possible in order to see was society any slower in evaluating this one versus some of the others? I don't know. Ebola is the only other one I can think of.
SARS.
SARS. There's a lot of
Mm.
hysteria with SARS.
Well, it seems that we've learned a lot from the AIDS epidemic, right? And at the same time, it seems that Shields explains everything by some sort of homophobia that was pervasive through medical agencies, government agencies, and so on and so forth. He's probably right for a part. But it's true also that those medical agencies move very slowly in many cases. And that's what we've learned with the AIDS epidemic. So for example, for Ebola, they move much faster. And then, you know, when later on, when for example, the FDA had drugs that were actually proven to be efficient. And you know the process at the FDA is also a very long process. And when ACT UP actually chained themselves literally to the FDA to ask the FDA to release those drugs, well, the process of releasing drugs, the process of approving drugs, was shortened. You know, so it's true that we've learned a lot with the AIDS epidemic about how to handle, you know, those new viruses, you know, that are threatening us.
Is there a med school here at AU?
No, we don't have a med school.
Not yet.
We do not have one.
A pharmacology or drug development?
No. I have a question.
Sure.
Are there any recent books that you would recommend on the topic of AIDS?
Absolutely. Now the title escaped me, but Jennifer Breyer from UIC, Infectious IDs, has written, I think the best book on the AIDS epidemic. It's a book that dates 2012. Published by the University of Chicago, and it's called Infectious IDs, and the name of the author is Jennifer Breyer. That's probably the best book that we have so far about the historiography of the AIDS epidemic.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Stay a few moments and chat and have some cookies.
Please.